So I'm going to be in charge of the next several hours. And I wanted to just make a mention that um, we will have a time with Anna Loy from the Mint Lab, who will present her work. And then we're going to get into over the night into some of the works that make up the newest part of envisioning intelligences. And the envisioning intelligence, just as a reminder, this is something that came out of the places and spaces mapping science, which dealt with static maps and macroscopes. And we decided to turn our attention to envisioning intelligences. And that includes linguistic, kinesthetic, communication, musical, emotional, and other intelligences by biological and technological life forms. We've focused on collaboration and coordination across life forms and intelligence types, and inspired discussion about existing and future sensors and actuators, memory and reasoning, exploration and communication, plus shared goals and desirable futures. And since we were just embarking on this particular direction with the exhibit, there's a huge learning curve because none of the people here are as experts as the people talking tonight on the subject of intelligence. And so in preparing for this 24-hour, we did a lot of research on who is doing really interesting work. And we discovered the Mint Lab and thought that their work was incredible and wonderful. And so we're happy that we have a representative here, Anna Loy. And I think, um, Anna, were you going to share your slides for this presentation? I think that's
Yeah.
how we were going to do it. So yeah, absolutely. Welcome. Um, Let me just say a little bit. Anna is a PhD candidate at the Mint Lab at the University of Murcia under Paco Calvo. She previously completed her Bachelor in International Forest Ecosystem Management at the Eberswalde University for Sustainable Development in Germany and a Master of Forestry at the Yale School of Environment in the US, followed by several years of working in China at the Asia Pacific Network for Sustainable Forest Management and Rehabilitation, in forest restoration and sustainable forest management projects all across Asia Pacific. As such, she has a background in forestry and forest ecology she uses now to explore how theories of consciousness and intelligence relate beyond the individual to the community and group level in forests, especially in relation to phenomena such as the mycorrhizal networks, inosculation, clonality, and forest ecology at large. And she is currently working under the Mint Lab project investigating collective intelligence in forest ecosystems. It is such a pleasure to have you here, and really looking forward to what you have to tell us tonight.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah,
Should
absolutely.
I just go ahead and start sharing the presentation or?
That'd be great. Yeah.
Okay. That's exactly how I was hoping it would go. Yeah, so I mean, you already explained a bunch of stuff in terms of like what I'm trying to talk about today, which is like this question of whether forests are intelligent and how we can scale theories of cognition to the community level. As was mentioned, I'm part of the Mint Lab, and the Mint Lab itself, full name, the Minimal Intelligence Lab, kind of focuses on cognition in, let's say, non-traditional organisms, right? So usually we think of cognition in terms of organisms that have brains, right? And we are more interested in the minimal form that may not, for instance, need a central nervous system. And I was kind of thinking, because I know you guys were originally contacting Paco, so I'm sure you're also a little bit interested in like just the conversation of plant cognition. So I'll do a very, very brief introduction to that and then kind of try to move on to what my research is, because as like a forestry person, I'm obviously more interested in like many plants than one plant. But we'll start with there. Um, you may or may not have heard of plant cognition, but basically a question we often get at the Mint Lab is kind of like, well, why do you think like plants could even be cognitive? They don't really have a brain, right? And within like the cognitive science, there are like different ways you can approach this question. You can like look at like fundamental frameworks in terms of like how do we define cognition, or what's the substrate of cognition, or how does it actually work? But you can also look at kind of like behavioral indicators, right? So there are certain behaviors or certain tests that we usually or like certain indicators that we associate with kind of like cognitive behavior. And in that context, I just wanted to kind of give like three examples. The first one being goal-directed behavior, right? So like a lot of intelligent organisms, they kind of pursue goals even when the easy trajectory changes. They're adaptive in their reaction to new circumstances or new information that is being presented to them. So my advisor always likes to make this analogy of like a metal ball versus a metal head because he's into metal. But the idea is that with a metal ball, it always falls down. It is just bound by physics, and there is no variation in the trajectory it is going to take. While a metal head or a person, once there is like a goal, for instance, I want to go to a different city. If a road is blocked, I will like try to maybe take an alternative route, right? And this type of goal-directed behavior can also be investigated with plants. So what you see here circulating the entire time already is one of the experiments we've done to investigate goal-directed behavior, where basically you're seeing a bean plant. And because bean plants or vines, one of like the most important things they need to do is like they kind of need to find something to latch onto. And the way they search usually is via this, like what you saw, this circumnutation, like rotating and rotating. And that usually initially is kind of like just a circle, right? But like the idea would be if the plant is goal directed and if it adjusts based on new information, then it should change its trajectory once it starts perceiving the pull, right? And so in this experiment, they were kind of like basically taking this trajectory and analyzing it, seeing if the plant actually kind of adjusts as it gets new information. Now, we're not entirely done with analyzing this, but like, for instance, here, initial results are at least encouraging, right? And that's like one instance where we're like, okay, maybe this is like a sign of like plants being cognitive. Another one is this idea of risk sensitivity. Now, risk sensitivity theory basically predicts that agents should switch between risk proneness and risk aversion depending on state and circumstances, especially according to the richness of the least variable option, right? So that basically, like to break it down into really plain language, it means when organisms have enough resources, they don't tend to display as risky a behavior as if they don't have enough resources, right? So think of a big predator, right? Like we all know when, for instance, a lion or a wolf is like really starved, they eventually start going for like really, really big prey, even though it's extremely dangerous for them. And so very smart researchers, this time not from our lab, specifically Danner, Kolchanik, and Chemif, they wanted to kind of like assess that in plants. Like, do plants show risk sensitivity? And so what they did is they created a condition where the plant had enough resources and one condition where the plant didn't have enough resources. And then, as you can kind of like see in this image, they kind of put the plant, it was like a split pot experiment, which means one plant in the middle, and then on the left-hand side, there was like one pot where they grew roots in, and on the right-hand side, they had like one pot where the other part of the plant, the same plant's root, were kind of growing, right? And basically what they found, and in one pot, there's a constant distribution of nutrients within the pot, and in the other pot, it's variable. So the total amount of nutrients was the same, but one was very predictively and easily distributed, and the other was more variable. So it was more hit and miss, right? And what they basically found was when the plant had sufficient nutrients, it would tend to go more for the constant pot. It didn't want to risk so much. Like it didn't want to risk like having a failure and rather have like just a little bit the entire time. However, when the nutrients were scarce, the plant actually showed exactly this kind of risk sensitivity, and it started growing more in the variable pot. Kind of like you can imagine it was kind of trying to hit the jackpot more or less, right? So that's like another part where we see, okay, plants can like very flexibly and smartly like adjust like their growth strategies depending on what environment they're basically facing. Um, the third and probably like one of the most famous examples of plant cognition studies has to do with learning. Now, I'm sure you all can like kind of like imagine the connection between learning and cognition, right? Like organisms that learn can potentially be cognitive. There are forms of learning that are less associated with cognition, for instance, habituation and sensitization. But then once you get like to something like learning by association, you can kind of say, okay, like this organism can definitely associate like different conditions together with each other and like modify its behavior, right? So in case you don't know what learning by association is, think of like Pavlov's dogs, right? Like where they kind of like had like the food where the dogs already salivated, that was like their unconditioned stimulus, and then they had the bell that they would ring, and that was the conditioned stimulus, because before training there was no correlation between the food and the bell, right? And then during training they would always like kind of put them together, so each time the dogs got food, the bell would ring. And eventually the dogs started salivating when they only heard the bell, right? That is basically learning by association. Now, Gagliano and colleagues actually tried to translate that to like a plant case, right? And what they did is they basically constructed like this kind of like Y maze, like you can see in the picture, where the plant basically has to grow left and right, right? And they would have different training conditions for the plants. So in some conditions, the unconditioned stimulus for a plant is basically blue light, because plants really like blue light, so they grow there either way. And the conditioned stimulus was a fan, because a fan, you know, it's windy or not, the plant doesn't care that much, basically. And so in some conditions, they would always pair the light and the fan together, right? And in other conditions, the fan would be on one side and the light would be on the other side. And what they basically found was during test day, right, when they only had the fan, in the conditions where the fan was previously always paired with the light, the plant would grow towards the fan, and where they were trained on opposite ends, the plant would actually grow away from the fan. Now, this experiment has, to be fair, been under strong criticism, first and foremost, actually by our own lab, just because of the way the experimental controls were done. It was like a little bit sloppy. And like actually my colleague from the Mint Lab, Adi Puncture, like he and like colleagues actually brought out a paper in terms of like how such an experimental setting could be improved. And we're actually now working on replicating the experiment and the results. So just to say, it's not necessarily that plants definitely do this, but this is one way you can investigate cognition within plants. And that's why I still kind of brought up this experiment, because I think people can like really relate to that. Now, the issue is, or like one aspect of plant cognition research is, so the field is still pretty young. I think like 20 years more or less. And basically, the field was started by people that largely came from like animal behavioral research, cognition research, and they took a lot of like what they tried in animals and tried to adapt it to plants, right? That's why you, for instance, in the last experiment I just showed you, you get like the Y maze. The Y maze was originally done with rats, you know, rat goes A or B. You kind of see, or like in the case of like the bee mutation experiment, like you only want to, because an animal always only moves in one direction, right? So you would just want to have one tip that you can track. The problem with that is that that is not really plant-like in a lot of cases, right? So like plants can often grow in multiple places. They don't necessarily have to choose A or B, right? They can like also just grow in both places. Or some plants, they naturally don't really like grow in a pot. like, I mean, no plant grows natural in a pot, but like they would not stay very singular. So maybe instead of going in a Y maze like A or B, maybe they would like send out rhizomes and grow to the side and have like an additional plant kind of coming up, right? So there's been like some issues with the current research, right? Now, you may wonder, why is this like why is it so difficult to compare plants and animals beyond animals? Sorry, plants don't have a brain, right? Um, it has something to do with like the fundamental nature of plants and animals that which is strongly mediated by their life habits, right? So if you think about plants, they're rooted, they're modular, they're autotrophic, and plant behavior is actually largely realized via growth, not locomotion, right? For the records, plants do move to some degree. They, for instance, have kinesthetic movements and other stuff, but a lot of plant behavior is simply realized via growth. And also because plants are rooted and autotrophic, right, they have to capture a lot of nutrients and sun. So actually what they care more about than like going to a specific area is to fill space with their bodies in like an optimal manner, right? And like it also means that plants, they don't stay compact and like in one place, they actually extend out into the environment. And because they have like this unlimited growth where they add modules over and over again, actually their sensing organs are like very, very distributed throughout the entire plant body. When you compare that to animals, animals are usually locomoting, right? They move from A to B, and they're thus more centralized because it is hard to move something that's extremely extended from one location to another. So they have more specialized organs. A lot of their sensing structures, for instance, eyes, are more localized into one or two specific points. And yeah, their behavior is primarily realized via movement. So in the case of animals, this leads to like a greater degree of autonomy and independence from their environment because because the organs have to be moved around, right? Meanwhile, plants, they are way more embedded into their environment and they extend much, much further, right? And so this has actually really interesting implications for plants at large. How do I go forward? Yes. Um, for instance, this extendedness and embeddedness actually influences how individuality works in plants. So plants have systematically have lower individuality than animals. Not only are their modules often semi-independent, but they also like have like very untraditional ways of being that we don't really find as much or at all in animals, right? So I'm just going to give you three examples here. One is plant clonality, right? The other one is that two different plants can merge together. And the third one is that plants are not necessarily one unified whole, genetically speaking, even they can display genetic mosaicism. So I'm just going to go into each one of them like very briefly. So when we talk about clonality, right, like plants reproduce sexually, but they can also reproduce asexually and actually kind of like extend out via runners and rhizomes, right? So they often use clonality for that. And that has to do like with, again, this ability of unlimited growth, which enables them to do though. So that means often like this, for instance, is like ivy that grows all outside at least my house, right? And when you look at an area like that, you think, oh, that's like a lot of different plants. But often it's actually the same genetic individual that like just covers infinitely large areas, right? And it's basically just one individual, but also kind of not because they're differently integrated. So some clones are very tightly integrated, some are not. And the other thing is with plants, you can never quite tell. So if you look at the right-hand side, you may think, oh, that looks like a really normal forest. But this is actually Pando. This is one of the largest clones and oldest clones in the world. It's 42 hectares large. stands in Utah. And I think it's kind of been around since like the last ice age, but it's basically one genetic clone that's all over this area, right? And so questions of what is the individual here get really hard. Is it the individual tree up there? Is it the genetic individual? Is it all the individuals that are physically connected? What happens? We're going to come to that point, but what happens if like their roots merge together again? Becomes it then one individual again, right? So you run into a lot of issues with plants and individuality because of clonality. Now, next one I wanted to mention is merging, like specifically inosculation. That's the kind of the natural merging together of plants, right? So plants, it does take a certain size, and ideally yourself or from the same species, but plants can kind of merge together if they stand very, very close by. So this picture on the left, for instance, is actually from my neighboring state park where we have really old redwood trees. And these trees basically over time, you can, I think you can see my arrow. You can see that up here. They just kind of like started merging together again above ground, which is these days we don't see that very often because good old commercial forestry has really put a stop to that with even spacing. But that basically happens naturally within trees when they're just kind of like clustered. One thing that is probably even more frequent, but that we don't necessarily see because it's underground is root grafting. So we don't have a lot of good studies on that because usually it requires what you see here, which is the total destruction of the forest, to figure out which trees are grafted together. But from the few studies that we do have, it seems that root grafting between conspecifics, that is trees of the same species, is actually quite frequent, which means that even though you may not suspect it, a lot more trees are basically part of like the same physiological unit than you may think, right? So again, it becomes pretty difficult. Like, what is the individual? There's even, and actually, this ability of trees is basically the entire foundation of horticulture, right? Because when we talk about like, let's say, having a tasty apple, that's really just one clone that we keep grafting onto like wild rootstock or like local rootstock over and over again. This can be done to extremes. This is actually an art project, but was really done. Somebody, what he named the Franken tree, actually grafted 40 different varieties of prunus, that is peach, onto the same base stock, and the tree just kind of like blooms like this, which is insane, right? But so all of this to say, this ability of trees to merge together makes the whole conversation even harder. And then as a final piece, we have genetic mosaicism. Now, one really big difference between animals and plants is that plants display something that we call somatic embryogenesis. That means, for instance, in animals, usually the germ and the soma, so that is like your eggs, with which you reproduce, and your body, they're usually separated. So any mutation that happens to the body usually doesn't get transmitted to the next generation, right? But in plants, those two are not separated, which means as a plant keeps on growing, these mutations can actually accumulate, which often leads to plants, especially when they're like large and old, eventually kind of becoming these genetic mosaics where they're actually, genetically speaking, not the same individual anymore. So what you see here on the right-hand side is the major oak. That's the oldest oak in the UK, stands in Sherwood Forest. And they've done like some tests on that oak, and they found like, oh, there must be at least like 3-4 genetic sections within that tree that just like significantly differs from each other, right? So again, makes individuality a lot harder. Now, this goes beyond just the plants themselves, because the way plants extend out into the environment, they often use other organisms and communities actually to do a lot of their most fundamental work. For instance, a lot of plants, they're mycorrhizal, and they use like these mycorrhizae to obtain nutrients and often to extend like kind of like their senses and their abilities. And these associations are so old, they're actually associated with plants conquering land in the first place, that plants are severely reduced in their ability to survive at all without these communities. Same with bacterial communities. Some plants even put in little nodules where the bacteria can live, and that's how they obtain their nitrogen. So again, it's like this whole idea of like, where does the plant start and stop? Now, if you like now wonder, okay, where does the plant stop and stop? Then you may also start wondering, well, then where does plant cognition start and end if plants are already so embedded and extended, right? This question of where cognition starts and ends is actually a wider question within the field of cognitive science, right? There are different theories of cognition that place cognition in different parts. So some say, okay, the cognition is mostly in the brain. It's brain-bound. That's like kind of the mainstream view. Some say, okay, it's also in the body or mediated by the body. And some say, okay, it actually extends all the way out to the environment, right? And so the most traditional option is kind of called cognitivism. Then you have embodied cognition for the body position. And then you have a couple of theories that include the environment. Extended mind theory usually extends cognition out from the brain into the environment. Ecological psychology says the unit of analysis for cognition is the organism environment system, right? So that's like all one big system. Okay, so let's move on and like specify it a little bit down, because I'm not gonna have time to talk about like all aspects of cognition within like the community level. So I figured I'm gonna restrict myself to like one example, which is memory. A similar question can be asked in memory. Where does memory live? Again, traditional view, it lives in the brain. Memory is stored in the brain, specifically either in between synaptic connections, right? Like you've probably heard that, like that saying, neurons that fire together wire together. Or there is in like kind of like a minority theory that also says maybe it also has to do something with the molecular memory, right? Like kind of like the epigenetics, and that might be the place where in the brain long-term memories are stored, because the synaptic connections usually don't last enough for like an entire lifetime. So people have been wondering how we can have memories that span an entire life. Now, then there is the position, okay, maybe memory also lives in the body, right? This molecular mechanism that I mentioned is evolutionarily extremely old. So there is no principled reason to assume that it only works in the brain. There might also be specific types of memory that are stored within the body, right? Another option is you can also use your body actually to externalize memory. So when you see this here, right, like I think we've all done that before, where you have like a really cognitively demanding task and you're trying to kind of keep track of what you're doing by like using your physical body to, for instance, count. This is mostly done by children, but adults also do that from time to time. And what you're basically doing is you're offloading your working memory onto your body so you can do something else with your thinking, right? And the third option for how memory could be stored in the body is actually something that's called like the bioelectric pattern memory, which is like probably one of the newest theories out there on the market. So I just wanted to take like 1 second to kind of talk about this a little bit, right? So this is coming from the Levin lab, and basically what they are claiming is via bioelectric patterns, morphology is encoded within tissues as a kind of memory. And they try to, I mean, they have a bunch of experiments, but like one way they try to show this is with planarians. Now, planarians, it's like kind of like a tiny type of flatworm, and they're really interesting because no matter where you cut them, they can kind of like regenerate to a whole planarian again, right? And so they wanted to show that bioelectric patterns matter. So what they did is, right, like if you, for instance, cut off the head and the tail, as you can see kind of here in B, they usually regenerate just like a head and tail again. But then basically what they did, and you see that here in C, is they manipulated the electric pattern. So these organisms, they have like very specific and then endogenous voltage gradients, and they manipulated that. And by manipulating that, they created like this weird like two-headed planarian. Here's a head, there is a head, right? And they wanted to show, okay, like the bioelectric pattern itself actually created that. Now, how did they know that that was not just like weird epigenetics? Because when they cut off like the part, if it was epigenetics, the epigenetics would be stored in the head, right? So they cut off both heads again, but they changed the bioelectric pattern for good. So when the planarian regenerated the second time around, once again, you had like these heads coming out. So it can't really be, in that sense, like epigenetic memory, right? So that's another way like the body can store memory. And then the last one is the environment, right? So this is like this whole idea that comes also from extended mind theory, that you can use tools, for instance, like a really famous example is like Otto's notebook, where this is like one guy that has Alzheimer's and he can't remember things, so he writes them down in his notebook, and he uses the notebook basically as a tool kind of to arrange his life and like make his decisions, right? Like as a memory. And there's other things that come to mind. For instance, the way we use computers, like we write down notes there all the time or set reminders in our phones, right? There's like a lot of ways you can kind of offload memory. Now, importantly, and I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, usually mostly tool use is discussed, but you can actually find also this offloading of memory in the wider ecological realm. Now, when we look at plants, right, like, and we think about, okay, what could possibly be memory within plants? So plants clearly do not have a brain, so we can put that one aside, right? But they do have a body. And like I said, the bioelectric pattern and the molecular memory are both evolutionarily old, and it is entirely imaginable. I think in epigenetics, there's also like have already done like some tests that this is like how plants store memory. Usually, when we talk about embodied memory, we don't necessarily account for morphology. I think that has a lot to do with like the fact that animals don't constantly change their morphology, but I think plants also, specifically perennial woody plants that like keep their structures, they also kind of like use their very body to encode like specific memories. So, for instance, this is like Pragus Silvatica, which is like European beech. And you can kind of see how there is a specific growth pattern to that. And like, for instance, the presence of the branches here influence like this little like shoots growth in the future. Well, in a short shoot, there is usually like restrictions in terms of like how the shoot can grow in terms of like lateral growth, right? So I'm gonna try to, I know this is like a little bit out there, but like try to illustrate that. We're going from the year 1997, right? Left side, good conditions, right side, not so good conditions. Right, so this first shoot, it grows very long and it puts like these little tiny buds here that are like very much capable of growing to the side. Well, in a bad year, it also has buds, but they can't really do anything. And also, this top thing only lets it grow like basically straight up in the next year, which means the short shoot basically prevents lateral branching. And this is determined by the previous year, right? So the body itself actually kind of like by producing these buds in the previous year, kind of like encodes a memory of the previous year into the plant, right? And so you get certain restrictions. Here, the plant cannot grow to the side, while here you see that the plant does it over and over again. Although they, again, also constrain each other, right? You see that like these shoots tend to go shorter. So the plant is like basically via its morphology kind of like self-constraining. Now, where are we? Here. Plants also can, as I said, tools are not the only way to do this. Plants can also extend out their memory into the environment. So one way we know this is happening is, for instance, via root exudates. You can kind of see them here. So plants like basically exude certain chemicals out into the environment, and they use those chemicals to tell other parts of themselves, other roots, where they shouldn't be growing, because usually when there is already a root in one area, the nutrients are depleted, so you don't really want another root to grow there, right? But like importantly, they're not doing that by sending chemicals internally, they're externalizing them and then using that as a cue for how they should be growing. And with mycorrhizae and bacterial communities, actually, they can modify the very composition of those mycorrhizal communities, and that can subsequently also influence their behavior, right? So they're using literal external communities for self-coordination. And actually, what's interesting, yeah, what's interesting is if we look closer actually to the fungi that we're talking about, they even have also like very similar mechanisms possibly to do that. So again, there is no principled reason they shouldn't be able to coordinate via bioelectric patterns and epigenetic memory. And we know that like the fungi themselves also have like specific fungal exudates like oxalic acid, citric acid, malic acid, and so on that they can then also potentially use for self-coordination, right? So the thing is, you have like a lot of different organisms that seem to all, to some degree, externalize their memory. So the question is, well, then do we see like any community effects, or what are the possible community effects of this action, right? So we know for one, soil electrochemistry can be significantly influenced by the organisms that live in there. Like I said, the types and frequency of different fungal communities, bacterial communities can be influenced. And also physical structures like decaying matter, but also, for instance, bioturbation, that's kind of like when animals bore through soil, can actually influence the soil itself. Now, the question is, does that all have actual memory effects, right? And for instance, this study looked at like the soil electrochemistry, in this case, how it changes based on changes in atmospheric conditions, right? And what they found was actually that there are long-range correlations between the soil electrochemistry and like basically these changes, they lasted for a long time, so that a very short-term effect, like let's say a thunderstorm, actually led to longer-term influences in the soil, which then is like a physical inscription into the soil of previous events, right? And so why did I spend so much time earlier talking about the Levin lab? Maybe this like whole change of like bioelectrical gradients reminds you a little bit of the bioelectrical patterns that we were talking about earlier in the case of like the planarian, right? Now, this is not only in the soil. This can also, for instance, be above ground, like influences. For instance, ecological memory is like a really big term that people tend to talk about. So that's generally the influence of past conditions on current ecosystem function. And ecological memory can, for instance, reflect historical disturbance or like a certain dominance of a certain species. And ecological memory has been proposed as central to how ecosystems respond to disturbance, right? So what can count as ecological memory? For instance, different material legacies, like you see here, like coarse woody debris, dead matter laying around. Also, when these trees fall, they build certain mounds and pits, right, that have like certain areas of mineralized soil. You have a seed bank of like species that put their seeds already in there that like kind of predisposes them for later actually regenerating in a certain species composition. And like other stuff that I should probably like move on so we stay within time. But you can see that there is like a whole bunch of stuff that can like serve basically as a memory device. And for instance, these structures, they can really influence how the success of a species makes or breaks. You might think, okay, what does coarse woody debris have to do with anything, right? Like some species, for instance, they get very easily browsed by, like, let's say, deer. And what they found is like, at least in some situations, like a lot of coarse woody debris can kind of act like a fence, right? And then the deer can't really get in and like eat these species, right? And so they tend to regenerate in these areas like more successfully. Or some species, they really, really need mineral soil, right? And there's different ways you can get mineral soil. For instance, a really bad fire. But in the case of wind disturbance, when trees are thrown over, like I said, they create these pits and mounds, and the mounds often have exposed mineral soil. That means when you don't have like these structures, this form of ecological memory, these species cannot self-perpetuate, basically, right? Now, one overarching principle that might explain this form of coordination is like a concept called stigmergy. So that is a mechanism of indirect coordination in which the trace left by an action in a medium stimulates a subsequent action, right? And when you think of like how this is defined, right? Like we have a lot, like with external memory, with like this like structure that we build, we have a lot of traces left by actions in a medium, right? And so that gives you a lot of like opportunity for actual coordination between the different actors within a forest. An important aspect of stigmergy, by the way, stigmergy originally came actually from like people studying ants, and they were wondering how ants were like super efficient going like one trail versus another. And it turned out they laid like they're laying like chemical traces that they're basically following. So that's like also a form of like externalized memory where they're kind of like they don't have to remember where to go. They just like keep following the trail. And like for instance, with like valuable food sources, more ants tend to go, so the trail gets stronger. So they kind of like have like this like self-coordination going on, right? An important aspect of stigmergy is that it enables complex coordinated activity without any need for planning, control, communication, even simultaneous presence or mutual awareness. And you can kind of see then how that might be really important in forests where we can't necessarily say, oh yeah, fungus A really wanted to pull one on tree B over there, right? Like that's not necessarily necessary for a forest to achieve self-organization. One more word on like the importance here also of spatial structures, because a lot of what I talked about just now, right, is like physical things that are happening, which means that the traces we're talking about in the context of stigmergy, they're of a physical nature. And it matters how these things are shaped and where they are, which means that spatial structure really matters. That is, for instance, your landscape structure, right? Like these pits and mounds, the coarse woody debris, the snags, but also the tree spatial arrangement. If you recall, I talked earlier about like this phenomenon of root grafting. Root grafting can really change the interactions between trees because they become a physiological unit, but they have to actually be close enough together in order for this phenomenon to even occur. And we know now with like commercial forestry that always spaces them like nicely and evenly apart, that might not even be something that's happening anymore in a lot of commercial forests, right? So this spatial structure really, really matters for self-organization. Now, we started with the question, are forests intelligent? Right? Like this was just like kind of like in preliminary inquiry. I'm not done with my PhD. And we only talked about memory. Memory is not the whole story of a forest. But I think what we can see here is that if forests are intelligent, right, and have like coordination between each other, they probably strongly rely on physical traces and spatial arrangement for coordination. And it is likely that the more we modify and especially homogenize these ecosystems in terms of species selection, spatial structure, and like also landscape, general structure, the less likely they are probably going to be able to display adaptive and flexible behavior, which is like one of these like key indicators for intelligent organisms. Yeah, and that's kind of it from my side. And I don't know if anybody is like nerdy enough to want like references. So
We love references, absolutely.
cool.
We'll have a look at those. This is great. I had to look. So just to check with you, the Frankentree, the picture that you have is not AI generated. Is that what it looks like, or
I mean, as far
it,
as I know,
it's not
yeah.
touched up? So that's amazing. I would have to definitely share that with people. That's really an interesting
I mean, you can
phenomenon.
even do it at home. I know of like a couple of friends that like to have like two or three varieties of like apple, for instance, on the same tree. So,
Aha. So, yeah, absolutely. If you have questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A section. Um, Here's a question that came in from Kadi Borner. What are you planning to do after you complete your PhD?
Uh, good question. I would love to keep researching this. The issue is, right, like my PhD is a lot about developing a theoretical framework, which was, to be honest, is hard enough to do. But the problem is, right, like I talk about this as like a theoretical possibility, but at some point, you got to figure out how would I measure that, right? Or like hypothetically, like what are the indicators for a more or less intelligent forest, right? Like we can't just go around and be like every forest is intelligent, right? Like we would have to look at like what are indicators, for instance, optimal coordination between different parts of the forest. And so this is not the main part of my PhD, but we're trying to start to look into how could we experimentally verify that, right? Like what kind of indicators could we search for? And so I think after my PhD, what I would really like, aside from, also probably writing a couple of papers about these ideas, would be to develop like an experimental approach and then actually go in and see, for instance, when we're in a monoculture versus, let's say, a natural forest, like do we actually see in these indicators that forests are more or less well able to self-coordinate?
That's awesome. Yeah. When you were talking earlier, you mentioned about um, it being difficult to design sort of tests of cognition because we're basing it from what we know already, whether that's we're designing tests for animal intelligence based on how we would define intelligence, and for plant cognition based on how animals. Are researchers becoming better at designing as we get to know more about how plants interact with the world and with each other? Are we getting better at designing those types of tests, or is it still kind of hit or miss?
I mean, so me and my advisor are literally in the process right now of publishing a paper on how you could make it more ecological or ecologically valid for plants to actually be tested in these like cognitive areas. So I think there are like a couple of ways you can do it. For instance, you can just like let's go back to the single plan, right? Or like to the plan that's usually talked about in plan cognition. You can try to just include more growth forms, right? Like you
Hmm.
can try to include, by definition, like clonal plants, you should have less focus on like the single tip, right? Like allow the plant to like flexibly kind of like find its own solution that doesn't require it to act like an animal. A lot of the issue also with a lot of lab experiments is right, you try to have like a good control, so you tend to homogenize the environment. But one of the aspects of being like that embedded and extended is like the structure of the environment, the information that they get, the richness of the information is actually really important for plants for coordination, right? So
Hmm.
one thing we're like suggesting in like that paper is, for instance, often plants are just potted in like this very homogeneous soil. Soil in the real world has layers. There's an A, B, C layer, right? And like humus on top, right? So you can still have like your experimental control by making these layers like equally in each pot and maybe having like one area with like nutrient richness in one part of the pot, but like at the same point in each pot. And then you still have your like kind of like experimental validity, but you also get a little bit more of like that ecological validity in there.
Hmm. So, here's another question. As we're doing this envisioning intelligence, as we're becoming aware of sort of like how some of the history of these discussions, and some of the maybe the different methodological or ideological frameworks go. One of the things that I've noticed is the use of either plant intelligence or plant cognition, but not necessarily interchangeably. Like I notice some people use it and some people don't, or use what prefer one term or the other. Does that signify anything? I know there's a difference between intelligence and cognition, but I'm just curious about like how that applies to in the plant world.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I was gonna put cognition. because I think cognition is like the more neutral term.
Mm,
It defines cognitive behavior, but not the quality of it, right?
mhm.
So, intelligence to me is often kind of like a like nearly like a valuation, right? Like, am I intelligent? That's
Yeah,
like on an IQ
yeah,
scale, pretty high. So I'm not like a huge fan of using the term intelligence. Why did I in the end use it? My partner, who is not involved in this stuff at all, very helpfully pointed out to me that I make my stuff really unreadable by putting weird words everywhere. So I was just trying to um, okay, because you can like always go a little bit more into detail, and I think throughout the talk I mostly actually used the term cognition. Yeah, it's just I think there is like a problem sometimes when we try to translate something from like the scientific realm to like the general public. So that
yeah,
would probably explain like that would be for me the biggest difference. Like people know what intelligence is, not everybody knows what cognition is. So
yeah, yeah. And that's the direct, unfiltered feedback that you would want from your partner, right? I mean, this is yeah. Um,
yeah, that
that
and the
that
big question mark on his face when I talk.
um, do you find resistance to? I'm just trying to. I know we did some surveys initially about just like would how would you define intelligence, and do you think that animals are capable of based on that definition and are plants and um it was we need to do more of them because I don't think we got enough people and it was a very limited size and space that we did it in. Um, but do you encounter a lot of resistance to the idea of plant cognition or plant intelligence? And if so, do you think that points to something sort of uh, like an ideological barrier that people have a tough time getting past, or what's your sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. So, I mean, I personally so far have been lucky because I haven't really done a lot of talks and like published a lot of things. I haven't been attacked too much. My professor Paco Calvo definitely gets like his fair share of hate, like from
Mm,
like especially like traditional plant physiologists or traditional cognitive scientists, right? So, this is a really, really contentious field. And actually, the presentation I gave today, if you think plant cognition is contentious, then like force intelligence is like probably one step up from that.
mm,
It is really, really difficult. I think people have vastly different ideas of like what cognition or for that record memory actually constitutes, right? And so people use the same term, but they don't mean the same thing, right? Like when we often
mm,
talk about like human cognition, we talk about like I don't know, imagining the future or planning ahead or doing math problems. And I can't make a plant do a math problem, right?
right.
Um, I think a lot of the contention actually comes from like though like in an implicit anthropocentrism, right? So how did cognitive science start? We looked at ourselves. We said, wow, we're pretty damn smart. Let's look at what qualities we have. Okay, these are part of cognition. And then we started looking everywhere else for like these very specific traits, right? But like these traits, they have evolved under a very, very specific in a very specific ecological context. For instance, when we externalize memory, why do we do it via like tools like notebooks? That has
Mhm,
something to do with like how our eyes evolved. You actually need high acuity vision, which is extremely rare throughout the world, to sorry, throughout the different kingdoms and species in order to like see a tool like that. You need or like you're at least highly advantaged if you have like flexible appendages to make a tool in the first place, right? So like the specific ecological niche that we are kind of occupying has led our cognition also down very specific paths. And I
yeah.
think people really struggle with the
Mm,
idea that there is totally different expressions of cognition because especially with plants that diverged from us like so early on, right? And that's like something I tried to pick up on with like this idea of like, okay, plants are rooted, animals are not. What is the difference? Like you get such different challenges that you actually have to address as a plant versus an animal, right? Like if you think of like what is the challenge for a plant, and you think about trees, which since I do forestry, I think about all the time. Um, Trees could be called like the world's most advanced architects. Like Do you have any idea of like the static challenges that a tree has when it like consistently grows all of these branches to not just break off or like fall down, right? Like they have to basically create structures that are incredibly intricate, that like we need to study in university for 4 or 5 years in order to have even an inkling on how to build something like that, right? So
Right.
what they are good at, is part of like their ecological niche and their evolutionary trajectory. So I
Mhm.
think once we can like step out a little bit of this, like, okay, like cognition is what humans are good at, then we
Mhm.
are a step closer to appreciating cognition on like a wider scale.
Ye- During your talk, I've had several experiences of this, and I think like in doing research on plant intelligence, I think it started when I read. It probably for a lot of people started thinking about these things with the novel. I think it's The Overstory. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
Richard Powers, I love
Yeah, yeah,
it.
yeah. And it was one of those things where I'd learned something and I was so like bowled over by it, and it was so fresh and new to me, that I had to read it to the nearest unfortunate family member. Like, listen, you have to hear this, But it's exciting, and there's wonder. I'm curious how much of that idea of discovery and wonder, and that just that feeling of that plays a part in the work that you do. Is that are you always kind of like um just a little bit bowled over by what you're learning about how plants interact with their environment and
Yeah, I mean, I think discovery is like the best part, but it's also the most important part that you keep an open mind. It's actually funny. One of the things that I early on heard from people is like, don't try to imagine another organism. You can never do it. But I actually found that to be the most useful tool,
Hmm.
to kind of try to not go from my own perspective, but like think about trees and think about what they're doing, right? And then like looking into just different worlds. Like one thing that I'm really obsessed with is this idea of like sensory ecology. I don't know if you've read like An Immense World by Ed Young, but it's like this way that we perceive our entire world is so predicated by like our specific senses, right? So like
Hmm.
the the world that plants perceived is so strongly, for instance, modulated by chemical sensing, right? Or by like electrical gradients potentially that they find, right? That like play close to no role in our life, right? Like we're vision. We do like image forming vision basically, which is so different. Or we are very auditory, right? And so
Hmm.
these different organisms, depending on what Umwelt, what sensory ecology they actually have, they just have like a totally different experience of the world. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think you have to stay curious and like try to think like them and less like you.
Well, and this is a great way to start us on that path. Thank you so much. I really have enjoyed this and learned a lot. And yeah, absolutely. Thank you for joining us for this. And I hope that you can stick around and see others. We also typically record these and put them up on YouTube later. So if you're not up for staying up with us the rest of the 24 hours, uh,
Yeah,
you
I
can see this.
unfortunately have to go to a Christmas party, but I'll make
That's
sure
not
to check out the
unfortunate. That's great.
recordings.
Great. Well, it was a pleasure meeting you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.